Now we push further into thinking about moral values and the problem of evil. Have you ever heard somebody ask, how can you possibly believe that God is real or that He's good when there's so much evil and suffering in the world? Often the people sharing these complaints do so with a real sense of hurt and anger. Pain and suffering, for many of us, is not some abstract philosophical matter, but a personal struggle and experience. Os Guinness asks, how can we respond? Oz acknowledges that this challenge is the greatest mystery in human life, but he challenges us to take a closer look and to be honest both in our questions and our answers.
If anybody does work in apologetics, and especially the social issues and the sociology of knowledge, those particular areas of study, Os Guinness should be a household name to many of you. He was writing when I was doing my undergraduate in studies and was such an inspiration to me. He was actually mentored and trained by the great Francis Schaeffer. He did his undergraduate studies in London and then his PhD work at Oxford University, authored over 25 books, many of them just award-winning books. The thing that amazes me about Oz, whenever I listen to him, actually he never has even a piece of paper in front of him. It's because he knows the field that he's dealing with so well. I believe his voice is one of the most vital voices of our time because the issues sociologically are immense and actually tearing away at our culture. Issues like tolerance and all of those matters that connect to that particular subject. Os Guinness is a vital lecturer, and you will see how helpful his material is to you.
Where was God when the tower fell? The day after September the 11th and the terrorist strike, I was invited on ABC television, and that was the first question. An hour later, I was on National Public Radio, and the interviewer asked me, I saw a woman running through the smoke crying out, God, where are you? What should I have said to her? Both of them apologized to me afterwards. Those were questions that demanded a soundbite when you really can't give soundbite answers to deep things like evil and suffering, but they knew they had to do it. Now, as it happens, evil is the greatest mystery in our human lives. Time is a puzzle. What is our human consciousness is a puzzle, but none of those weigh on us like the challenge of evil. It's also the greatest problem of our time. We've just lived through the most murderous century in all human history, with a third of a billion human beings killed by our fellow human beings. And the questions it raises are profound, not just why does God allow, but what does it say of us as humans that we are the species that does that to each other? So this is a tremendous challenge. I believe we should always give honest answers to honest questions. But of course, when it comes to evil, a lot of people don't have honest questions. They're just using the problem that they don't really care about to try and beat people because of their faith. And it's often said that evil is the rock of atheism. And because of evil, you really can't believe. Now, I'll argue something very, very differently, but that's where they're coming from. But always, as I said, we should give honest answers to honest questions. My approach, and I don't mean I run through this mechanically with everyone, my approach is to try and think through the questions that all of us face as humans. Because we don't start as Christians, Jews, atheists, Muslims, or whatever. We start as human beings in a world and we're trying to make sense of it. So let me run through just some of the questions. I think there are 7 major ones, but we haven't time in this talk to run through all of them. Let me cover some of them very quickly, and then major on one that I think is at the very heart of the answer that we need to give. The first step in thinking it through is to recognize the sources of evil and suffering in our lives. A lot of people want to know, where does evil come from ultimately? Now, none of us actually knows. The Bible tells us where it enters planet Earth, and Jews and Christians believe it's through the evil one and his temptation of Adam and Eve. But that's only how it enters planet Earth. We don't know how it enters the universe. You can speculate. The greatest speculation of all is John Milton's Paradise Lost, but it is a speculation and goes well beyond what the Bible teaches, magnificent though it is. But we recognize three sources, and they are the sources of where we face either evil or suffering in our lives. Now, evil and suffering, of course, are not the same. Evil is active, the intent to do harm. Suffering is passive, those who experience the harm done to them. But you can see the three sources that we all share. One is our bodies. The second is nature. And the third, the biggest, are fellow human beings. Many of us have watched the Olympics. The incredible speed and strength and prowess of the human body at its most magnificent. But think of the genetic dysfunctions that can hit before we're born, or the 1,001 diseases that we could face after we're born and experiencing life, and of course the really tragic things that often come at the end of life, like dementia. And you can see how fragile this little power pack that our body really is. When Winston Churchill was knocked down by a speeding car in 1931 in New York, forgetting which side of the road the traffic goes on in America, he said, I'm surprised I wasn't broken like an eggshell and crushed like a gooseberry. And of course, that's our little bodies. And you can see how evil it is when people play on that, burning bodies to ashes in gas ovens, or as they said in the Rwanda massacre, you're merely cockroaches and we can stamp you out. The second source is nature. And we've all seen tsunamis, earthquakes, hurricanes. I happened to be born in north-central China in the time of the war with Japan. There was a terrible famine. And in 3 months, 5 million died. And people were just dropping like flies all over the place. Lovers literally going out into the fields, embracing each other, and just dying there. My 2 brothers died. I nearly died. My mother nearly died. There was no food, no medicine. And my mother said later that she could have been a ballet dancer or stockbroker for all the use she was as a doctor without any food or medicine to give anyone. And it was an extraordinary time. I survived, and I often think, why me? Why not me? My brothers died, I lived. And you can see that that's the cry of many in circumstances like that. The third source is our fellow humans, and sadly, that is the worst and the greatest source. As I said earlier, 100 million killed in war in the 20th century. Another 100 million under political repression. 75 million maybe under Mao Zedong. And a third 100 million under ethnic and sectarian violence. As G.K. Chesterton said, if you think, we talk about wild animals, but we are the wildest animal. Now that first step only helps us to be realistic, which many people aren't. Any of us may suffer, and all of us, with that exception, will die. The second step goes deeper. Listen to the questions. Every sufferer is unique. But you can see at the same time that underlying all the suffering that everyone faces, certain questions are pressed out instinctively and irrepressibly. One, why me? The universe we take as terra firma, solid ground. But all of a sudden, for whatever reason, something hits us and there's a nervousness and a randomness. 3 soldiers go over the brow of the hill, 2 are killed instantly, third one's unscathed, except for the recurring nightmares. Why them? Why not me? My brothers died, I lived. Alexander Solzhenitsyn says millions died around him in the Gulag. He lived. Why them? Why not him? Why me? The second question runs deeper. Where's God? Something is so irrational, so unjust, that there must be an answer. There must be someone accountable. And so the heart cries out, and even atheists who don't believe in God blame God at times of supreme evil. Stendhal, the only excuse for God he doesn't exist. Baudelaire, if there's a God, he must be the devil. Woody Allen, if there's a God, he better have a good excuse, and so on and so on. But of course, for Christians, the greatest cry, where's God, was Jesus himself. Now we know he was quoting Psalm 22, but surely out of the anguish and the dereliction and desolation of what he faced, there was a deep reality there. Why? Why had he been abandoned? The third question is, how can I stand it? Now that sounds, and it is, the most practical. Someone wants to hang on to a truth that with the pain gets them through the night or through the day or whatever it is. How can I stand it? But in fact, it's also the most philosophical. Albert Camus used to say that the first question of philosophy is, why not suicide? Now, he wasn't being depressing. He was saying, at that moment when everything looks dark and despairing, what is it that keeps you living? It's that reason to life. And if you don't know why, well, why not suicide? The awful thing was that in the death camps at Auschwitz, it was the atheist intellectuals who recurringly took their own lives. Jean Emery, Bruno Bettelheim, and the most amazing of all, Primo Levi. He was a survivor for 47 years. He lived to be a witness to the horror of what he'd seen so that it would happen never again. But at the end of 47 years, he committed suicide. And many people go back to an incident in Auschwitz. There was a day he was deeply thirsty and he saw an icicle growing outside the hut. He reached out to it, kind of like for a free drink. But a guard, seeing him, just smashed the icicle to the mud. Instinctively, Levi cried out, "Why?" And the guard answered with a cold brutality, "Here there is no why." And when he took his life, eventually, there was no reason to live, even to be a witness to the truth that it might never happen again. How can I stand it? Now, those are the questions which need answering, but we need to really understand the intensity. The third step is to appreciate the modern transformations of evil. I don't think because of the 20th century we're more evil than previous generations, but we're more modern. And modernity has done various things. It's done some good things. For a start, modernity has minimized pain, and of course that's good. Think of the anesthetic in the 1830s, or the invention of the little aspirin in the 1890s. So around 1900, historians say, for the first time in human history, an adult could live most of their lives without any significant pain. And that's wonderful, but there is a downside. That's behind the Pollyannaism of many modern people. They've never suffered. They've never seen death, of course, except television violence, and we know the actors bounce up again afterwards. And so we love our video games with all sorts of gratuitous violence and so on, but that's unreal, surreal. And many people have never really experienced death. I had. I saw hundreds of dead bodies before I was 10. And I was brought up in a world of immense realism by the reality around me, as well as by the very realistic faith of my own parents. But beyond that, modernity has magnified destructiveness in ways that we need to examine. Not through weaponry. People think of nuclear weapons, but actually only one nation has used it. And thank God, none of the malevolent, malignant dictators of history have had their hands on the nuclear button. So it's not weaponry per se, but it's things in modernity, like the division of labor, the diffusion of responsibility, the way we run chemical factories, the way we run car factories. That was exactly the way that Auschwitz was run. So there were many, quote, good Germans who were part and parcel of all that happened, but weren't directly responsible, although they helped it happen. And you can see how modernity is magnified. I mean, you can press a button at 29,000 feet in a bomber and obliterate a city. And one's so detached from it, one hardly feels the moral significance of what one's doing and so on. That's the third step, to profoundly appreciate what modernity does for us and our capacity to be part of evil. But it's the fourth step that I want to major on. And that is, we need to assess the different frameworks or philosophies of life or worldviews to handle evil. Evil and suffering are so momentous that we need to interpret them to ourselves, to face them adequately. Now, a lot of people say, well, there's 1,001 answers, worldviews, religions, philosophies in the room. How on earth can anyone choose? There are 1,001. But for all practical purposes, there are 3 big families of faiths, and very few exceptions outside them. I use the word family because these different faiths have a family resemblance because they agree in what is the ultimate source of reality from within their worldview. And when you see it that way, there are the Eastern faiths, the secularist faiths, and the Abrahamic faiths. By the Eastern faiths, I mean Hinduism, Buddhism, the Reform movement within Hinduism, and of course today, particularly in California and other places, the New Age movements. They go back to an ultimate source of reality they see as an impersonal ground of being. So as the Hindus say, we are God's temporary self-forgetfulness. So what's evil in that framework? Well, the world is a circle, a cycle. It's driven by desire, which leads to craving, which leads to attachment, which binds us to the wheel. And at the end of our little lives, we don't die, we die, but then we're reborn. And the problem isn't death, it's rebirth. And unlike the Californians who in the 60s talked about reincarnation, groovy man, groovy, in the East it's a matter of weary, fatalistic resignation, round and round and round. And freedom, moksha for the Hindus, freedom is freedom from this world. So there's no vision of justice or freedom or an end of suffering in this world, not at all. Nirvana, which the Buddhists aim for, is the great deathless lake of extinction. Now, take an example of that practically. There's a wonderful Zen poet called Issa, and he wrote haiku poetry, the 17-syllable poetry. He had 5 children and a wife, and one after another, each of them died. And he went to the Zen master in his time, and he said, why? And every time the Zen master said, remember, Issa, the world is dew, D-E-W. Dew, transient, impermanent, sun rises, dew evaporates. That's suffering. Don't get detached. Renounce and become detached. Well, Issa wrote one of his most famous poems. And transliterated in English, it runs like this. The world is dew, the world is dew, and yet. The whole logic of Buddhism is in the first 2 lines. The logic of a father grieving inconsolably is in the 3rd and 4th lines. And you can see that's the dilemma of the Eastern religions. There's no answer in this world. The only answer is from this world. Freedom is not freedom to be an individual. It's freedom from individuality. What about the secularist family of faiths? Atheists, agnostics, naturalists, materialists, and so on. They have a more realistic view. We come from chance, that's the ultimate source of reality, what Bertrand Russell called a chance collocation of atoms, and we're moving towards the common doom, again as he said, of extinction. So here in this world there's no meaning. As the existentialists put it, the world is absurd. It's deaf to our human cry for meaning. So if we want meaning, we make it up ourselves. It's a do-it-yourself faith, a self-invented faith. So there is a heroism, a bravery in humanism when they tackle evil. I remember as a student meeting Bertrand Russell, fighting against the nuclear issue. There was a craggy, aquiline look to his face that showed the bravery, but never-ending defeat. That was Camus' word. And of course his picture was of Sisyphus rolling the stone up the hill. Roll it up, down it rolls again. Roll it up, down it rolls again. Never-ending defeat. And that's his word he used in the book The Plague, which is his metaphor for evil. And Dr. Rieu is heroic. He cannot bear to see a human die, so he fights it for all his worth. But at the end of the day, after the burial of one of his friends, he says, I realize I face never-ending defeat. Now, what's the problem in that view? Well, Arthur Schopenhauer, the German philosopher, put his finger on it earlier. He said, existence itself is the error. In other words, what is what's wrong. Well, if what is and always has been is what's wrong, how on earth can you overcome it? Samuel Beckett, the Irish French-speaking playwright, put it well, Waiting for Godot. He said later, the major sin is the sin of being born. Existence is the error. The sin is the sin of being born. So you fight it for all you're worth, but forlorn, never-ending defeat. How about the biblical view, so common to Jews and to Christians? You could give a lot of answers here, and many people have done so magnificently. But in a short time, let me just pick it up from one angle. One of the challenges to faith is what's called the trilemma. How can evil be evil, God be all good, and God be all powerful? So unlike a dilemma with two horns, a trilemma has three. How do you bring together evil and the goodness and the power of God? Well, the temptation is, like Rabbi Kushner, to relax one of them. Evil is terribly evil, Kushner says, and his teenage son dying of rapid aging disease. God is all good, but not all powerful. That is not the biblical answer. In the Bible, you have all three stressed. Evil is evil, God is good, and God is powerful. But they're given a distinctive twist that turns them from a challenge into a deep reassurance. I haven't time again in depth to go into all of them. But let me put it like this, and let me stress. The first one, is evil evil? Yes, but it should have been otherwise. It's not supposed to be this way. In other words, what is not what once was, and it's not what once will be. So what is now is the result of sin, disobedience, the fall, and sin has come in like a gate crasher, like a party pooper. So that when we feel outraged against evil, shocked by grief, or whatever it is, we're feeling, and we should feel it, the disjointedness of a world that should have been otherwise, a broken covenant, something's badly wrong. Is that the biblical view? Absolutely. I love the fact that if you read the Gospel of John in chapter 11, the story of Jesus at the tomb of Lazarus, famous because it includes the famous shortest verse in the Bible, Jesus wept, which is often a question in Sunday schools. But actually, many people don't realize that 3 times it adds something. Not just Jesus wept, and thank God he did, but also he was furiously outraged. There's one word used twice and another word. They're both strong. The stronger one, used twice, is used by, say, Aeschylus, the tragedian, of Greek war horses, rearing up on their hind legs as they hear the battle trumpets, snorting through their nostrils and charging into battle. And that word, to snort in spirit, is the deepest Greek word used of outrage, indignation, and it's used of Jesus. Why? He'd made the world good. He and his Father had said it was good, very good. But now he enters it, and it's broken, marred, ruined, not what it should be. And Jesus is furious. And we too can grieve. We should never be angry, as the early church taught, when we shouldn't be angry. But we should never not be angry when we should be angry at things like the abuse of children or the trafficking of women or whatever it is. There's much in our world that should have been otherwise and was not supposed to be like this, and that's what the Bible teaches. The second truth, is God all good? The Bible says yes, and no other God has wounds. For followers of the Jewish way, I think the deepest expression of that is Isaiah 53. The servant God sends, Isaiah says, is one who comes, is tortured, hideously disfigured, and will die on behalf of God's people. Now, of course, followers of Jesus see that fulfillment in the Messiah, Jesus himself. And the cross has always been the thing which has anchored down the goodness of God, who cares, who comes, who suffers, who dies for us. And you can see that many people wrestling with the problem of evil have found satisfaction there. For example, Dostoevsky. He came to faith, as he says, through the hellfire of doubt. And the crucial moment for him was 4 hours alone, standing in front of Holbein's The Descent of Christ from the Cross. In other words, the taking down of the dead body of Christ. And as he puts it in the Brothers Karamazov, I do not know the answer to the problem of evil, but I do know love. The third question is God all-powerful, and is it rational to trust him when we really don't know what he's doing? That was the question thrown against faith, particularly in the 1950s, by great atheist skeptics like J.L. Mackie and A.J. Ayer. And I think the best answer was given by Basil Mitchell, who at the time, I think, was the only believing philosopher. Today, there are hundreds of Christian philosophers in the philosophy departments of the world, but they weren't then. And Basil Mitchell gave this wonderful parable of the resistance fighter. Imagine World War II and someone who wants to fight against the Nazis in France on the resistance. He meets the local resistance leader in a pub. And the resistance leader said, look, we've got 2 hours together tonight. Ask me any question you like. But if you're willing to sign on at the end, this is the last time we'll talk together face to face. It's too dangerous. You've got to trust me in the dark. Now, sometimes you'll know what I'm doing. I'm rescuing our people. Sometimes you won't. It'll look contradictory. I'm in Gestapo uniform, arresting our people, and you won't realize I'm releasing them off stage. You'll have to trust me. Only when the war is over and the victory is won and the codes are broken and the secrets are open, then you'll know exactly why I was doing what I was doing, but you won't know here and now. And as Mitchell pointed out, that's what it's like for a Christian in what C.S. Lewis called the enemy territory. Now, of course, the supreme question is, can the resistance fighter trust the resistance leader? Or put it in Christian terms, can we as followers of Jesus trust God when we don't know what God is doing? So there are 2 crucial questions every Christian should have answered. One is God there, his existence? And that's fully, finally answered in Jesus. Through Jesus, his life, his death, his resurrection supremely, we know God is there. Secondly, is God good? Again, through Jesus, we can trust God to be good. He's the Father of Jesus, and Jesus introduces him to us as our Daddy, Abba, Father, and so on. Now, we don't know the answer to everything. There are lots of unanswerable questions. Why did God create the universe knowing that Auschwitz or my wife would have cancer? I don't know. There are many, many unanswerable questions. But we know why we trust God. We don't know why these things are happening, but we know why we trust God, who knows why. So we can say, Father, I do not understand you always, but I trust you. And we know why we trust God, even when we have to walk in the dark. It is rational to trust in a God who is all-powerful. The greatest objection to faith that I've ever come across is Adorno's challenge, after God, after Auschwitz, there cannot be a God. He also said, after Auschwitz, there cannot be love or poetry. In other words, no beauty, no aesthetic. What was the answer to that? Interestingly, the deepest answer came from Viktor Frankl in his book, Man's Search for Ultimate Meaning. Not Man's Search for Meaning, Ultimate Meaning. Frankl said very simply, those who say that were not in Auschwitz. And of course, Frankl was. He'd been through it. He also said, in Auschwitz itself, more people deepened faith and discovered faith for the first time than abandoned it. And you remember what I said earlier, it was the atheist intellectuals who couldn't stand the challenge of evil, and more of them committed suicide. But then Frankl went on, and he gives a wonderful little picture, which I've always loved. He said, if you have a little fire, it can be blown out by a little breeze. But that's an inadequate faith. The slightest test, experience goes against it, and it's blown out. But he said, if you have a strong fire, what will happen to it when a strong wind hits it? It'll be fanned into an even stronger fire. That is adequate faith. And when I read that, I was reminded of my own mother. We lived in that war with Japan. 17 million were died in that invasion. After the war, we shifted to Nanjing as it is today, which had experienced the most brutal savagery of any of the massacres in the 20th century. Auschwitz was the most cold and calculating. Rwanda was the fastest, but the Nanking massacre, the rape of Nanking, was the most savage and brutal, which even shook some of the Nazis who were witnesses to it. My parents had lived through both of those, and as I said earlier, we were in that terrible famine in which 5 million died in 3 months. But my mother used to say, it was in the darkness of that nightmare that my faith in God became unshakably real. Is evil the rock of atheism? Far from it. Actually, atheism founders when it looks evil in the white of the eye. And I would say from the depth of my heart, it's the Christian faith that has a truth and an adequacy that is able to look into the eye of evil, but with one hand in the hand of God, and come out deeper than ever before.